Last week or so for Marvel's Avengers, we've actually had some pretty great interviews across various different sites. Now there's two interviews that I'm going to break down today because we've got some really nice information from them. One of them is from Games Radar, and the more substantive one that had some pretty awesome information was bizarrely from PlayStation Trophies. Not someone I would expect to get a really good interview, but their interview was fantastic. Now we'll cover details such as they've talked about synergy attacks that characters can do, how new heroes will work, fair amount of information on the Spider-Man deal, so it's really interesting to hear that. Talk about potential X-Men in the future, which is pretty amazing, and then there's some discussion around Endgame content as well. So let's jump in and we'll check out what they had to reveal. We start off here on the beta, and this is really how the beta will differ from the main game, which is really relevant given we had the beta weekend just there and we've got another 2 ones coming up. Now the individual replying from Crystal Dynamics is Vince Napoli, and I believe he's a lead combat designer, and I'm pretty certain he was a lead combat designer on the most recent God of War game, which means he really knows his stuff. Now the question was about the size of the war zones and how different they'll be in the final game compared to the beta, and how much exploration there will actually be available in the war zones once the full game arrives. Now, answer here, we've only included a very small amount in the beta. I think there's drop zones and harm rooms, and that is correct, that's what we've got there. We wanted to pick as much of a small sample size as we could for the beta, but it was also like, well, what are the introductory levels so we don't spoil too much? What are the ones where we're not giving too much away? So there's absolutely bigger ones, there's grander spaces and more interesting biomes that you want to save as a sort of wow moment, and we didn't want to spoil them for the beta. So that is one of the criticisms I've seen about the beta, the fact that every so often you just felt like you were going through the same corridors and fight and aim. So it's really good to hear that we're going to have some new interesting environments to go in, and from the trailers that's already been spoiled to an extent. We've seen some of the trailers that look like they actually take place in space or on space stations, so that'll be pretty awesome. Next up we had a question. It was to do with the level of visual customization available in the game, because it's not like a standard action RPG game or MMO where you pick up gear pieces and it changes how your character looks. Now the answer has really got some nice information in it. So it starts off with that said, there are other ways we found to expand the loot system. We have these things called exotics. You can actually view them in the game. They're above legendaries in regards to rarity. They showed as an orange drop, but these are pulled from the furthest reaches and corners of Marvel lore, and you may find in obscure comics of all genres. They allow us to pull things in from the likes of the Doctor Strange universe, so it's very interesting to see him getting name dropped there, and I wonder if that's a hint or not. And then it's mentioning that those actually you do visually see, because when you activate them you'll sort of materialise them and you'll see the visuals. You'll need to excuse some of the way this has actually been worded, it doesn't sound very good to read out. But moving on here, so when we found ways to squeeze in as much as we can in the gear stuff and pull those in and get visuals where it can and where it makes sense, we're still expanding that. I will say that a lot of attention was put towards figuring out the way to customise it and wrap it around the Marvel's Avengers thing. The loot system is designed specifically for that. So one, you've got the mention of Doctor Strange, which is really pretty awesome there. I imagine he is a character that could come in the game. I'm thinking probably in the not long-term future we'll get the likes of Black Panther, Doctor Strange and maybe Wanda coming. That's just who I personally believe. Captain Marvel as well, of course, but it's interesting to see him get name dropped, and it's interesting to hear about these artifacts that I imagine are going to be really powerful ones, and it'll be interesting to see what they do visually as well. This next question we have here came from the Games Radar website. The rest of them all actually came from the PlayStation Trophies site, but this is in regards to synergy attacks of sort for characters. So they're stating there's more subtle sandbox moments, like using a heroic and hitting another character who happens to be supercharged by lightning. In one of the war tables we actually seen that. We've seen Iron Man fly past Thor, who activated his buff skill, and it actually buffed Iron Man with lightning as well, which looked pretty amazing. So they're saying we decided to let the mechanics work in a way that's a lot more sandboxy and a lot more fluid, rather than trying to deliver them as all these kind of bombastic but more constrained cinematic ones. So I really like the idea of that. If any of you actually played Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3, you had specific synergy attacks in this, but in this it looks like it's allowing you to actually make up your synergy attacks almost and discover them, so that's really great. Now moving on from this, according to Napoli, he says that how you choose to traverse up each hero's skill tree will affect these organic interactions, giving you more chances to make some Marvel magic happen. There's a bunch of those moves actually hidden in the skill trees, and then he goes on to say oh actually, if I get this skill and then I fire this one and I have this certain ability on my not dead character's shield, so that's Captain America, then they're able to reflect the beam around and hit enemies. So basically they're confirming that you can reflect Iron Man's beam off Captain America's shield, which is really pretty amazing. And the fact that it's not an ability that's listed within the skill tree, that's awesome as well, because it really opens up the number of abilities and combos we'll be able to do. We have an interesting question here in regards to DLC characters having their own story arc. So it looks like this is something that's mandated by Marvel. So this is, I believe, the creative director. I'm not going to try and say his surname, we'll just call him Sean. So he's saying that's the plan, it will depend on how deep we go, but no character can be introduced without a story. That's part of the Marvel rule. So we have to have it introduced with a story arc, understand what the character is going through and potentially what villain is creating conflict with them, and that is how we start to delve, and then there'll be a sort of major narrative payload in the direction we choose, or wherever we feel that we can add a bigger storyline. I believe they touched on that to an extent during the last War Table when they were talking about introducing Hawkeye and each of the characters having their own specific storyline, but it's interesting to see that 100% confirmed and it is mandated on Marvel's part. We then move on to the extremely touchy subject of the SpiderMan PlayStation 4 exclusive. So we got a lot of nice information from this. So they're asking, can I ask about Spider-Man, which has had quite intense negative reaction. So that's definitely right when they're saying that, and ask them if they're surprised by how negative the reaction has actually been. So creative director stating the Spider-Man topic is very delicate, that's an understatement. It's above us in terms of the relationship between Marvel and Sony. So this looks like Crystal Dynamics had nothing to do with this. Marvel and Sony, who are two pretty big hitters, basically told them to do it, and they had to do it. So he's stating we really don't have much say in that. We're excited about putting a version of Spider-Man and having that version of Spider-Man live in a world, which is very crucial for us. Other than that, I can say that Spider-Man will have his own story. We confirmed that a moment ago with the last question. His own story arc, and it looks like villains that he does say may rather than will, so I think he's been a little bit cagey with this, but I'm pretty certain you will get Spidey villains, which again is a real disappointment for the other platforms that will miss out on some potential iconic Spider-Man villains, your Dr. Octopus and your Rhino and so on. But he's saying that's probably all he can say about it, but there's actually some follow-up questions and we find out more as well. We have some more confirmation here that looks to confirm the deal really was above them. So they're asked, I think a lot of people are kind of venting at Square Enix and Crystal Dynamics as well. To clarify, is it something that was basically gifted to you by Marvel and Sony that they were like, actually, you can use this character on PlayStation if you want to? He's stating, I don't know the details of it, again that's above us, so being very cagey understandably, but I will say that it's really just a relationship between Marvel and Sony, and we love having Spider-Man, so we jump at any opportunity to have him, but you know there are rules on this. The next question and answer we have here is a pretty short one, but it's actually really important. So the question was, is it fair to say that it will be a kind of self-contained story arc for him in Marvel's Avengers? The answer's short and sweet, it's absolutely yeah. Now this is a big concern I actually had, and I've seen other people's echo that concern as well. So this is due to the fact that when Spidey is introduced on only one platform and you have a consistent story going forward in all three platforms, you can't have Spider-Man's story really be that important because it can't affect the platforms he's not going to be available on at all. So really for me this is a lose-lose situation. Other platforms won't get him, and the platform that will get him is most likely going to get a watered down self-contained version of his story, whereas if he was on all the platforms then you could really open up the story and make him a much more important character. So that's pretty disappointing. Final bit of information we have on Spidey, and this really supports the concern I was talking about a moment ago of his story being self-contained. Now I won't read all of this, but there's certain sections in here where he mentions the fact that there's been no swapping or changing of the story to accommodate Spidey, and also that he doesn't affect or change the story in any way. The plan is always moving forward, and it hasn't changed as a result of his inclusion. So from reading this here, if you read the full thing, it really does sound like they've been developing the game, they've got their story all laid out, and then Marvel or Sony have came to them and just said, you need to put Spidey in the game, and they probably wondered, how do we do this? So you've got this, what I imagine will be a small self-contained story there for them. But that's everything about Spidey. Let's actually talk about the X-Men now. This here then was the most exciting part of the article. The Spidey bit was actually really interesting, but this part is really exciting. So the question was, when you said you can kind of pull from anywhere in the Marvel Universe, does the license extend to characters like Wolverine, Beast, Rogue and XMen who've been part of the Avengers? And if so, what's the process of choosing a new character? So Creative Director states, yes, it extends to all of the 80-year history of Marvel. The process of choosing these characters is, can we ground them in the world? Can we make a real argument to Marvel? The character belongs here and the character will move the story forward or take us into new stories. Now that is really pretty awesome because you've got a fair amount of X-Men characters that have doubled up as Avengers characters at some point in history, and also if you can bring in an X-Men character, let's say the likes of Wolverine for example, then you have to bring in X-Men villains as well, and although they're not specifically tied to the Avengers, they will be tied to the new X-Men character that's coming in. So a few years down the line will we see some kind of huge X-Men expansion with Avengers X-Men in it? Looks like it could be very likely, so that's really pretty awesome. Moving into the final part of the article then that touched on Endgame Content, we've got an interesting question and answer here. So the question is, can you confirm whether, this is relating to Endgame Content, this will be still geared towards 4-player groups, because some games have larger groups for raid-like content? The answer is, right now the current ones are just for 4 players, but there's also of course expansions and other things planned that we haven't talked about yet, other types of content and stuff like that, but currently the ones that are on the short-term plan are for 4 players. So that seems to indicate that they are looking to add more expansive content that would have a larger roster go in and actually challenge it. So that does sound pretty awesome. I wouldn't like too many, because currently when I played the beta, the PlayStation 4 Pro I had was really struggling with 4 characters, so I wouldn't want too many in with the visual effects were just overload. So hopefully if they maybe up to around about 6 characters, then that would sound like the sweet spot for me, but that does sound pretty awesome as well. Finishing up here then, we've got a fair amount of information to read out about the Endgame content that's coming. So the question was, it was recently confirmed that you're planning to add raid-like content added to Marvel's Avengers a few weeks after launch. Can you comment on how that works and whether it's going to be similar to the villain sector that's in the beta? The answer being, we've been using the term raid-like content because it's actually multiple types of in-game content. We're currently working on loot tables, tuning a lot of the stuff for the post-launch, because we've got planned to introduce these higher end mission types and objectives in a regular cadence. Some of the missions might resemble a villain sector. That's the one in the beta where you fight the huge warbot, and I actually really enjoyed it. It says it culminates in those huge boss fights. Again, that would be like the warbot. We also have an end game type of content that will be out a couple of weeks after launch, which is hives and mega hives. This actually utilises your entire roster in a single go. It's really designed around the idea of how far you can get with a single character before that character is extinguished for you, and then you need to switch to the next character and see how far you can get. So it's interesting, this content that's actually going to encourage you to level up all your characters, but hopefully there's a way to speed that up a little bit with the more characters you get and the more characters that come out in the game. It's also mentioning that one challenge your full team makeup, which is a very, very different style of in-game content. Then we actually have a group version of that where you get to plan your roster in order and then team up with your friends who've planned their roster in order as well. And it's a question of which characters do you use first and which characters do you use last. They then go on to talk about different content that will be coming for in-game players. So they're talking about a type of rapid, high intensity, high pressure missions. They're only open for short intervals before they refresh on a couple of days timeline, stating they have a breadth of in-game content, and that's talking about the hives and the mega hives they've also mentioned, and also that in the next war table they might go more in depth as to what the in-game content will actually include. But it looks like they have got a ton there, and that's exceptionally important, because when you get through that story mode, not sure how long it will take, but when you get through it as a games as service game, if you want to keep the game running for years, there has to be some pretty solid in-game content there. So that's everything we actually found out. It really was a fair amount, and again it was a pretty awesome interview by PlayStation Trophies, so hats off to them for all the information they managed to get out of them. Now do let me know what you think of all this in the comments below, and thanks for tuning in, stay safe, and I'll see you all again soon.